today's topic will be chiropractic care, tips to keeping our skeletal structure God gave us in working order, and who better to ask than a chiropractor to help us think through the pros and cons of mainstream allopathic medicine practices versus alternative medicine and potential pitfalls there, benefits, pros, cons. Let's bring up Dr. Tim. And he's a good friend, actually. He's given me some personal tips and shown me some, lower back stretches. I had a back injury a while back. And he's also a deep thinker, as you're going to hear, on philosophical understandings of medicine and history. He's actually got a master's in history and, of course, chiropractic degree, studied law. So sort of a Renaissance man. It's great to have you with us, Dr. Tim. And I know you're going to get deep into the big questions about the pros and cons of the different kinds of medicine. But can you start us off with some practical stuff about, how does somebody know that they ought to visit a chiropractor versus just doing this or visiting a, mainstream? Who do you recommend sees a chiropractor? How do you know? And then also some tricks and tips for proper stretching, proper posture, these kinds of things. I mean, shoes, whatever we can do to help us so that we don't end up with problems with our spine.
Well, Scott, those are a lot of questions. I think we could be here for 3 hours if I just kept talking about those, but I'll try to be succinct. One of the things that's important is that it's what you're hoping to accomplish with chiropractic care. So, for example, there are athletes like Aaron Rodgers, who I think is a quarterback for the Jets, Tiger Woods, who a great golfer, and Olympic athletes. They all see chiropractors regularly. And what chiropractors do for them is help them to continue to move and perform at peak levels. And that's because they're not only just manipulating their spine, but they're manipulating other joints. Sometimes people do a technique called active release technique, where they're actually working on the tissue and fascia and helping people stretch. So it's really what you're trying to do. If you're an athlete, a weekend warrior, you're someone who likes to pile up the miles doing marathons, you would probably benefit from regular chiropractic care. And then there's people who have chronic disease, degenerative disease, and they may even be getting treatment, pharmaceutical treatment, other medical treatment, and they too may benefit from chiropractic care. In my own practice, I have a wide diversity of patients. I have some patients with frozen shoulder, and I treat them for that. I have patients who have headaches, and I treat them for that. Patients who went through an accident, have a traumatic brain injury, and have balance issues, I treat them for that. The most important thing you need to do when choosing a chiropractor is just vet them, see what they're about, see what they do, make sure that they're tailoring their treatment to you and your condition. But I always think about it like this. If you have back pain, I always go in the order of least invasive first. So if I can do it by rest, relaxation, stretching, hot and cold, then I'm good. And if I need to get help, then I might go to a chiropractor or physical therapist. And if that doesn't help, maybe I'll go to a physiatrist, another medical doctor, and see what I can do and work my way down before just jumping in and getting a cortisol shot or a Medrol dose pack and a bunch of muscle relaxers, when I could have maybe went the natural route first prior to doing all that. And again, even if you do go the medical route first, sometimes just a little bit of maintenance therapy by a chiropractor or physical therapist is helpful. So that's kind of my short answer of all that.
You know what? That is a worthy conversation to have in full. I want to get into our philosophical medicine discussion, but also one thing I didn't nail down at the beginning: how do people find you? Because they're going to go, I can learn some things from this particular teacher. And do you have YouTube, Rumble? Do you have a place that you want to send people?
I do. Well, I have my website. It's drtimperenich.com. They can find me there. On Rumble, I have a site for prophetic history and archaeology. And then I have another site, Restoring the Right Hand. Both of those are on Rumble. One's more medical, one's more prophetic. Those are ways to find me. And then I'm also on Facebook and Instagram.
I love the Bible prophecy stuff. Folks aren't aware of this, but I got to do a Bible prophecy seminar at Dr. Tim's church, and he was doing some of the messages as well. So that's good stuff. And you gave us, just a little glimpse into the chiropractic. But how about those of us who are feeling pretty healthy and we aren't trying to treat something? Are there some, just like general lifestyle hygiene stretching that people should be doing who aren't facing an injury or a condition of any kind?
Yeah, absolutely. The more you can move, with free movement, where you're not stiff, the less likely you're going to get injury. There was a physician who was an athlete and actually an orthopedist, and he had a number of exercises, and like one of the main ones was if you could touch your toes. And if you couldn't touch your toes, you were more likely than not to be predisposed to having severe back pain. So there's a lot of things you can do with stretching. One of the issues with manipulation of the spine is really all we're gaining is increased range of motion. We're trying to help people to be able to function better. So it's really things like that. I look at chiropractic as both wellness and preventative, and I also look at it as symptomatic. But it just depends on how you're going to add that to your repertoire. To me, one of the best things you can do is hydrotherapy on a regular basis. It's cheap, it's effective. Stretching, it's cheap and it's effective. Those are things you can do on a regular basis. Sunlight, if you live in northern latitude, getting a red light bank in your home, making sure using a sauna, again, if you're in those northern latitudes where it gets really cold, just those regular things. And then of course, diet. To me, diet is foundational. I look at diet and exercise foundational, and then I see chiropractic as one of those interventions that you can do to kind of help. But those two, if you do chiropractic and not those other two, you won't get the results that you really want. And again, hydrotherapy, hands down, I do it all the time. I swim in the cold water. I think the water in an unheated pool here in Florida is probably 55 right now. I'll be swimming in it tomorrow. And that's a great way to reduce inflammation. You got to build your way up. But again, those are simple things to do. And then I look at chiropractic as something you can do to keep yourself well maintained, to keep that active range of motion, to keep you from getting stiff and all that.
For a wimp like myself, who isn't going to swim in a 55-degree pool, does the hot, cold shower, contrast showers daily, or at least ending with cold, is that helping to a certain extent for the same goals, or is that helping with something else altogether?
It helps. It helps sort of. The thing is with the cold waters, it's about acclimating yourself. So, when I first did cold plunges, I could be in a cold pool or an ice bath for a little bit, but over time you get used to it. So I do like when I've been sick, the hot and cold showers are wonderful, especially getting it on your chest, especially getting things tightened up. It actually sometimes even helps with congestion. But the cold water therapy, the swimming and things like that, that's really good for overall systemic inflammation. So that's kind of the way you have to think about it. They are doing two different things, and it just depends on how long you stay in the water, how much you heat up. But if you have a sauna, I mean, if you're, again, northern latitudes, there's people who live in Greenland, Iceland, all the Nordic countries in Scandinavia. They have the highest per capita of saunas, and a lot of times they'll go in the sauna and roll in the snow and come back in the sauna, and they do that all the time. And again, it's how long you're doing each and the temperature gradient between the disparity between the temperature. And there's something called the Russian bath, where you plunge in ice and then you go into a hot sauna over and over again. So there are ways to sort of manipulate it to get different effects out of it.
Yeah. Well, that's not something you're going to hear from your pediatrician when you take your kid to the doctor. Typically, you're not going to hear that from your primary care physician at a mainstream medical clinic, which, you said chiropractic is one tool among many that we have in natural medicine to address the issues and symptoms that we're facing. And one of the perspectives of Barbara O'Neill that I just so appreciate is that to a great extent, the body is healing itself, and you just create the right conditions for the body to heal itself. And you named them. You got a good diet, exercise, you're moving a lot. So when you get that foundation, you don't even necessarily need so much a proper medical philosophy to cure diseases, because you just have so much fewer of them, right?
Yes.
But I do want you to talk about these competing philosophies. What are the advantages of each, disadvantages of each?
Sure.
Tell us about allopathic medicine versus natural medicine schools of thought, and that's kind of the big question that will just carry us through. We can dialogue through to the end. I know you have some slides, so you can take it wherever you'd like from there.
Okay. Well, one of the things that's important to note that with allopathic medicine, the reason why it's called allopathic medicine comes from the word allos, which means opposed or against. And the idea is that you are to find a drug, a substance that opposes whatever symptoms you see. Now, a lot of the symptoms that you see are things that the body's actually doing. So, for example, if you have a rash, a dermatologist may not actually treat the rash per se. They will give you an immune suppressant, which stops the rash from happening, even though no one's exactly sure what's causing it. Sometimes they are. Sometimes it's a fungus. Sometimes it's bacteria. But a lot of times what we do in allopathic medicine is our job is to suppress. In chiropractic and other natural remedies, the idea is to enhance what the body's already doing. So, for example, if someone has a skin rash, the question would be from a natural perspective is, well, what's going into their body? What are they taking into their body that is the cause? Is it a food allergy? Is it something that they were injected with? Is it a medication that they took that their body's reacting to? Is it actually a skin condition that they got from some unsanitary place? And if it is, how do we address that? And often the goal is to treat from the inside out when it comes to that, how to correct the diet, how to find those type of things. So it's getting the body to do what it's naturally designed to do. Versus in allopathic medicine, it's like, hey, we have the drugs. We're going to do whatever we can to suppress, to change, to augment, to wreck the biological system to fix it. For one example, let's just take rheumatoid arthritis. In rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system attacks the joints, usually starting in the fingers and things like that. And it works its way sometimes centrally, just depending on the way it is. Sometimes it develops centrally, but long story short, the immune system is attacking the joints and it breaks them down until the bone is on bone. And then some people will ask for surgery or something like that. But one of the main treatments for rheumatoid arthritis is a drug called methotrexate. And methotrexate was a drug developed to fight cancer. And this drug actually blocks the absorption of folate, B9, which is essential to the dividing of cells. So basically what it's doing is it's blocking a natural function with something that would occur in order to reduce the immune system's ability to keep reproducing itself. In other words, it's stopping the storm of the immune system. And this is useful. Don't get me wrong. This is useful for people in pain. But the natural approach would say, well, wait, what is in the body that's driving the immune system haywire? Is it a toxicity? Is it a terrible diet that is pro-inflammatory? Is it that there's a nutritional deficiency? And it goes that way versus saying there's a problem. Another interesting archive of history as far as medicine goes is the diagnosis of pellagra. Pellagra is what we know today as a vitamin B3 deficiency, which is niacin. And the hallmark symptoms of pellagra are dermatitis, means rashes on your skin, dementia, obviously craziness, and usually diarrhea and some sort of inflammatory bowel condition, and usually death. Most people didn't survive pellagra. And so in the allopathic medical tradition, they thought, well, it's probably something that they would fumigate. They thought it maybe was a parasite. So they began to fumigate people. They would give them mercury. They would drug them because they were like, how can we stop this train of events? And then someone said, well, maybe it's in the diet. Maybe people aren't getting something that we've removed from the diet. And indeed, when pellagra started coming about, it was because they started milling flour and removing the husk, which contains all the B vitamins. And same thing with rice. So people in certain areas were eating, and also they were switching to corn versus some whole grains, which meant they weren't getting the B vitamins. So they didn't look at a nutritional deficiency, because the idea in natural medicine is that if the body is missing something, it's not going to function right. Now, there's sometimes a little bit of both overlap, but that's sort of the line there is. With allopathic medicine, we treat the symptoms and we suppress different aspects of the body to get people well. Think about cancer drugs. Their job is to stop the division of cells. And in many cases, the idea is that we stop the division of all cells, which means your hair falls out, your immune system goes pretty much kaput, and then hopefully you beat the cancer. Whereas the natural approach is, well, how can we boost the immune system? How can we reduce certain inflammatory markers? How can we change the environment of the body so that it's hostile to cancer? Versus the allopathic method, how can we drug the body so much that it's poisonous to cancer? Completely different paradigm. And, there's use sometimes in both. Like, for example, if I have a broken arm and my bone sticking out of my flesh, I'm going to want someone who has those allopathic skills to relocate the bone and maybe put a plate in it so that it'll actually heal, versus, you know, me trying to change my diet or not go skateboarding again or something like that. So there is room for it, but there's just a general theory of how it should work. The other issue is between natural medicine and allopathic medicine is that allopathic medicine, at least today, is always favoring newer technologies and more innovative structures and AI and all kinds of novel technology. Whereas the natural approach says, well, can we get it done simpler? Can we use more simple means that have less side effects, that are generally safe? Can we do it that way? Can we look at lifestyle versus just give someone a drug to bail them out? So that's kind of, in a nutshell, where that goes in the two competing philosophies. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it really does. And so I hear you're not calling us to shut down all the ERs, right? I
No.
mean, there's a place for it, but its place is not actually in healing. And mainstream medicine does not seem to really be getting to the root cause of the problems and helping the body heal itself, which is where you bring in these other methods, like those foundational items you mentioned with the nutrition and everything. And then at times visiting specialists like chiropractic. But are there any pitfalls on the natural medicine side, particularly from the standpoint of a Christian worldview, where, yes, we believe God made our bodies and we don't need to always just be poisoning them and using drugs and surgery and such invasive things in all cases.
Yeah.
If we can use natural means of healing, that's going to be the preferred. But also over here, are there any spiritual landmines, if you will, yoga and spiritualism and mesmerism and some of the 19th century movements that I know you've studied and written about? Give us a little bit of the landscape of natural medicine, where to watch out, even within chiropractic care.
Yes. Thanks. One of the things I always like to talk about is that not everything in natural is great. There's a lot of, and let me just back up. I'm in the field. I go to meetings. I have to do continuing education hours. I have a lot of colleagues, many of who I respect, but I also respectfully disagree with them on their theories about the body. And as far as yoga and all those other things, you know, that's someone else has probably addressed that better than me. I'm going to address the chiropractic aspect, because I do think there's dangers in a lot of Eastern medicine. There's some good, but there's dangers. And I had to actually study Chinese medicine to get different certifications. And I can tell you that there's a fundamental difference between the way Chinese medicine or Eastern medicine looks at the human body and the way that a Christian would. And in chiropractic, this Eastern medicine sort of has a historical foothold in it. So one of the founders of chiropractic was a man by the name of D.D. Palmer, and he was a grocer who experimented with mesmerism. And what people don't understand about mesmerism, which is sort of a euphemism today for hypnotism, what people don't understand about mesmerism is it was wildly popular, and people used to take magnets. And the reason why they took magnets is that mesmerism actually came from a practice called animal magnetism, which came from Franz Anton Mesmer. So think about it like this. Anton Mesmer created a practice called animal magnetism, which later was just called mesmerism because it was something that he founded. And what they used to do is they would take magnets and they would use the power of suggestion to get people to do things. And in the early 19th century, it was incredible. They could remove teeth without people being in pain. Women who seemingly were insensible to the facts of the world, medicine, science, and history, could be mesmerized, and they could give answers that would baffle people's minds. There were things that seemingly were miraculous that was all tied to this spiritualistic movement. It's utterly incredible, and it was so ubiquitous. As a matter of fact, mesmerism was so common that children would be on the playground trying to mesmerize one another. There was a story of a young girl who was mesmerized by her friends, and then when the bell rung, the kids ran in and they didn't want to say anything. The girl was catatonic, and then they had to get another mesmerist to mesmerize her out of that. So this gives you an idea of the type of context that this all existed, and it was actually thought of as science. The Academy of Science in Paris investigated it. Benjamin Franklin actually went over and investigated mesmerism, and he actually felt that it wasn't scientific, but others disagreed with him. They felt that it had a therapeutic value to it. And many of the theories of mesmerism were later adopted into hypnotism, and hypnotism into psychology, which is a topic for another time. It's a wonderful thing to realize just how some of the things that Satan invents work their way all the way into white-coated medicine. But back to chiropractic. So D.D. Palmer was a grocer, and he became a mesmerist, and he used to use the magnets and try to experiment, but he didn't find any use in it. He really didn't get anywhere with it. And so spinal manipulation is as old as Hippocrates and even was practiced by Galen. Galen actually treated a lot of gladiators in Rome, and one of the things he would do is he had this, it looked like a medieval torture device like the rack, and he would stretch men out and it would open up their spine, and he began to realize that spinal manipulation, which is extremely old, was something good. Spinal manipulation was also used by osteopaths who don't use it so much today, but in other countries around the world where osteopaths are licensed, they do a lot more spinal manipulation. So spinal manipulation is very old, and D.D. Palmer, knowing this and his theories about mesmerism, felt that if he could manipulate a certain joint on the spine, that it would release this incredible potential and do healing. And so he manipulated some guy who was allegedly deaf, and this guy was healed, and so chiropractic was born in 1895. Well, his son, B.J. Palmer, became the promoter, and they ended up fighting it out, and B.J. definitely promoted this, what we would call vitalistic philosophy. And this philosophy is summed up what they call above, down, inside out. And this idea of this universal intelligence lives in every single cell in our body. And some of you who have been paying attention would know this is pantheism. And so they began to believe in that and teach that. And so they taught is that if you could manipulate the spine, you could help release this innate intelligence that we have, this godlike intelligence that we have, and it could heal anything. And as such, chiropractors would, treat all kinds of diseases, saying that all I have to do is manipulate this segment of the spine and it would release this incredible intelligence. And there are chiropractors who believe this to this very day. I'm not one of them. And many of them are my friends, nice guys, but I cannot abide, because I believe that God designed us and that the machinery that we have is intelligently designed. But I don't believe that we have godlike power just residing in us that just needs to be released at the stroke of a wrist that you do on the spine. That is utterly absurd to me. What I believe is that if you're a God-fearing chiropractor, you should be praying, studying the human body, studying how God designed it, and figure out a way that you can work within the design parameters that God has set forth, utilizing your intelligence, utilizing your prayer, the Holy Spirit to guide you, but most importantly, where you're going to study very hard how the body works and what are the problems with it. So that's a big difference. And this divide is in chiropractic to this very day. There are chiropractors who we would consider very much vitalistic, that all you need to do is adjust and you'll fix everything. And there's other chiropractors who are like, no. Spinal manipulation is good, but physical therapy, stretching, red light therapy, exercise, all these things have a place. Hydrotherapy, nutrition. It's not just one type of spinal manipulation is going to fix it. So there's actually a divide in chiropractic over that issue. But natural medicine still has this sense of vitalism, this idea that, you take an herb and this herb has a godlike intelligence in this, and this gets assimilated in your body and releases, chakras and all these other things. And again, this is not what we would get from God. This is not what we get from the Bible. We don't have a godlike intelligence permeating in every single one of our cells. If you were to go to the Bible, you find that the Holy Spirit is given to them that obey him. The Holy Spirit is a gift from God. And even then, it's not ours. It is a gift. So we don't get to direct the Holy Spirit in each way we want. It is something that comes in us that convicts us of sin, unrighteousness, and leads us back to Christ, most importantly. So there's a complete difference with all that. So that is one of the major things. In Chinese medicine, they believe that you have all the innate power in you, and it's up to you to figure out how to release it. Again, more vitalism. Many people who have paid attention to history will know that John Harvey Kellogg got into a form of vitalism, which was pantheism, this idea that God's in the nature, he's in the plant, he's in your cells, he's in everything. And again, if God's in everything, he actually is nowhere. So that is a danger that is still in it. There's a lot of theories about the unconscious and all these things, which even tie back into psychology. So just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. And it also, this is why when you go see a physician, you shouldn't check your brain at the door. You should take your conscience with you. Remember, it's your body. You have to live in it. And if you don't want someone doing something to you that you disagree with, you have every right to say no. So that's very important to do, especially when it comes to all this. So I think that's a really good distinction. And because of that, because of the vitalism, this also ran into trouble with the doctors of the allopathic community, the American Medical Association, and chiropractors. Again, chiropractors have generally been against vaccines, against drugs, against a lot of it. And some of these things are noteworthy. I mean, it's actually good that you would have a skepticism towards drugs. There's a lot of kids that are now adults that I've met who were raised by chiropractors, who ate well, who exercised, who got adjusted regularly, and didn't take hardly any pharmaceuticals growing up. And they're very healthy because of it. And while that's good, and I think it's good, the philosophy is not. And so the allopathic community and the chiropractic community began to be very much at odds. And let me back up. It's not just the chiropractic community. The allopathic community was on a warpath with anyone who was not an allopath. So at one time they were on a warpath with the osteopathic association, and osteopaths used to do spinal manipulation, and they very much believed that if you could put the body in its proper condition, the body could heal itself. Osteopaths are now just like medical doctors today. They still get a little bit of A.T. Still's philosophy. A.T. Still is their founder. They still get a little bit of it, but not much. And there are opportunities to manipulate. Mostly physical therapists now do osteopathic manipulation. So there's osteopaths who were with the chiropractors at one time. There's also naturopaths. Naturopaths, licensed naturopaths, are trained very much like a primary care doctor, but their therapies are primarily nutrition, exercise, light, hydrotherapy, all those things. That's kind of, and even they do some oriental medicine. There were other practitioners also at the time. There were hydropaths. So there were a lot of different practitioners who were against drugs, were against vaccines. And so this put them square at odds with the allopathic community. The allopathic community was like, no, you're wrong. What we're doing is right. And so they fought head to head. Now, again, not everything the natural community believed was right, but the allopathic community had the power and the ability to do something about it. So that's kind of how it all starts, based on those two fundamental things. One of the issues is that in 1911 there was a man by the name of Abraham Flexner who was hired by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. And this, anytime someone says Rockefeller or Carnegie, you're like, oh, conspiracy, but it's actually not. You can look it up. You can actually go find the original document where the Flexner report, and you can read about it. It was published in 1911. And basically Flexner went around all the different medical schools and he rated them. And the importance about rating them was whether or not they would get money or federal money or scholarships or grants. And he felt that every school needed to be like Johns Hopkins, which was an allopathic medical school, which had laboratories, utilized drugs, and all these other things. And there were many medical schools at that time. There was a book written by Larry Elder, a conservative radio host based out of California, and he wrote about the anti-competitive practices of the American Medical Association to shut down all these medical schools. And that's exactly what they did. It's interesting to note that one of the earliest medical schools in the United States was not an allopathic medical school. It was actually the Hahnemann School of Homeopathic Medicine. And this is interesting. While many people don't agree with homeopathic medicine because the infinitesimal small doses and they think it has something to do with spiritualism, homeopathic medicine actually grew just like allopathic medicine. And they also had the title of MD. So that also made them mad. So they had to be shut down too. So there was even eclectics. Eclectics were people who were trained like regular allopathic doctors, but they didn't subscribe to all the drugs. They didn't subscribe to the surgeries. They tried to do things natural, using hydrotherapy, using herbs. And all those hospitals, all those things had to be shut down. And that's what they started to do. So as they began to shut them down, the allopathic community took over. And one type of medicine now pervades our culture and seemingly has the highest authority in the land. So that's sort of a rough spot, sort of a rough overview of what happened there. There's a lot of history in there. I'd love to go over it all, but I'm just going to talk about allopathic medicine and chiropractic. So as I mentioned, because of chiropractic's sort of vitalistic history, they began to be persecuted for practicing medicine without a license. And states at one time, so let me back up a little bit. During the Jacksonian era, prior to the Civil War, there was a whole set of laws put in place that undid licensing laws in states. And one of the reasons why they did that is they saw how doctors were taking advantage of the situation and stopping competition. And there were people like Samuel Thompson and others who were not licensed but knew herbs, used steam baths and things like that, and they were helping people, and hydropaths who were not licensed, and they were helping people. And legislators were like, hey, why are we banning all these people who are actually doing a much better job than the person giving you mercury and bleeding you? So they repealed those laws. Years later, the allopathic community gained ground again, and they began to shut those portals down. And one of the things they did is they began to stop other practitioners from being able to work with a license. So in addition to shutting down schools, they began to stop you from getting a license by the state. So then they would send informants and they would find practitioners, chiropractors, osteopaths, hydropaths, naturopaths, and they began to say, hey, you're not practicing without a license. And they would bring a referral to the state authorities, and many people were arrested. In some interesting cases, there were osteopaths and chiropractors who were often locked up in prison. And it turns out that the judge, his brother, his wife, his sister-in-law was treated by a chiropractor or osteopath, and he would often let them go free. And sometimes there'd be patients around these prisons, protesting that their doctor who had helped them so many times was being locked up. But these persisted for quite some time. I think the last laws that basically said that chiropractors couldn't get a license were finally expunged in, I think, the 1970s. And I think the last state in the union was Louisiana. It just begins to show you just how tough it was for people who did not have an MD after their name, so long as they weren't an eclectic or a homeopath, to practice medicine. So one of the things that I just want you to see here is that this never ended. As a matter of fact, the American Medical Association decided that, okay, if we can't get the state laws against them that way, we can find other ways to prevent them from making money and being a part of the fabric of the medical community. So one of the things that the allopathic community did through the American Medical Association is they would set up committees on quackery, and they would set up committees on public safety. And these all seem like nice names. They're trying to make sure that people don't practice without a license or people aren't doing quack therapies. That's what they try to do. But instead, what these committees really were is they were to stop people practicing in a way that they didn't think was right, especially if you were a chiropractor and things like that. They also lobbied successfully for many years to make sure that chiropractors would not be covered by insurance, which they are now, and make sure that they could never get reimbursed by the government through Medicaid or Medicare, which chiropractors do now. But they did all that because they did not want this medical profession to grow. And it's not just to the chiropractors. In many states in the union, licensed naturopaths are not allowed to practice medicine. And every year when naturopaths try to get accreditation to practice, let's say in the state of Florida where I am, someone from the Florida Medical Association shows up and says, hey, it's dangerous. Now, you got to ask yourself, if your therapy of choice, which is drugs, was in 2014 considered the third leading cause of death. So the top 10 leading causes of death, the top 3 are generally heart disease, cancer, and COPD. Well, and I think heart disease is usually about 600,000, 700,000 Americans die every year of heart disease. And of cancer, around 500,000 plus, give or take, 50,000 die from cancer every year. And COPD, around 180,000 die from COPD every year. That's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So those are the top 3. Well, it turns out in 2014, there was an article published in the Polish, it was the Archives of Polish or Internal, the Archives of Internal Medicine from Poland. And it was published by an author by the name of Peter Gache. And what he did is he looked at the statistics and he estimated that there was over 200,000 people that died every year from prescription drugs. And he said 100,000 die from taking the drugs as prescribed. They didn't add anything to it. And then another 100,000 died because of drug-to-drug interaction. They died because they took too much. There was an overdose. And so he points out that over 200,000 people died every year, estimating in 2014, which would make it the third leading cause of death. So if doctors, who their primary therapeutic is to prescribe drugs, are responsible for the third leading cause of death, how is it that they can go before a medical board in the state of Florida and argue that a certain group of people who don't even use drugs, who use hydrotherapy, nutrition, and all those other things, how could they say that they're dangerous? But they do every year. And because they have money, they are successful. It blows your mind away. So this is bringing us to the head-to-head with chiropractors and allopathic community. And this story will blow your mind. So in the early 80s, chiropractors were growing, in the late 70s, early 80s, chiropractors were growing. They were trying to get on insurance. One of the things that they were trying to do is work with allopathic doctors. In my own practice, I work with allopathic doctors all the time. I work with radiologists. I work with orthopedic surgeons, interventional pain surgeons, physiatrists. I work with brain specialists. You name it, I work with them all. And there's always a kind sort of referral pattern that we all have. We all recognize that each one has a role to play. But in those days, the allopathic doctors were told through the AMA not to work with chiropractors, not to send them referrals, not to do anything. That doesn't mean that they didn't. There were some who did. But by and large, they were told not to, because chiropractors were terrible. They were harmful. They were hurting people all the time. And they were working hard in states to make sure they couldn't get on insurance, make sure that they couldn't get Medicare, Medicaid. And chiropractors knew this, but they didn't quite understand it. So there was a series of meetings that they had. And this is kind of interesting. The chiropractors were having meetings in Dallas. And let me back up. So the head of the American Chiropractic Association and the International Chiropractic Association got a mail list of documents. And this mail came from Chicago, Illinois. And the AMA was headquartered there. And so they got this list of internal American Medical Association documents. And these documents showed how the American Medical Association was using its power by setting up these committees and lobbying government and talking to insurers and doing all this to stop chiropractors from being able to practice freely. And so there was an informant, and this was after the Watergate scandal, who styled himself as Sore Throat. You can look this up. You can actually go to a Time Life article, and you can see the legacy of Sore Throat, who was the informant. And he actually shared all these internal American Medical Association documents, which not only detailed the American Medical Association to suppress chiropractic, but also to suppress other medical doctors who were going off the reservation, like doctors who were going to use nutrition to treat people for cancer, or doctors who are going to use chelation therapy to reduce your risk of heart disease. They were going after all of them. And here's an interesting. This was actually published in the Vegetarian Times, which you might find, I thought was interesting that they actually had this in there. So this is an article from the Vegetarian Times, and they actually detail this. And they found out about this because of this document released from Sore Throat to the chiropractors. And so journalists began to talk about it. And so you can see the picture of the guy in black and white. That is Stephen Barrett. He's a psychiatrist. He operates a site, I think today, called Quack Watch. Now, there's a number of other sites that are operated that are just like Quack Watch. I think one's called the Skeptical Raptor, and something like Science or something. I love science. I don't know what it is. But they have a bunch of them. And what a lot of these are AstroTurf. In other words, they are funded through the American Medical Association. And these guys are basically they pretend to be honest brokers, but they are essentially a mouthpiece to reinforce one type of medicine. And here's the article. They talk about these people who are allegedly quackbusters, who basically go after anyone who does not follow the medical orthodoxy. And you can see the title here: Are the Quackbusters consumer advocates or medical McCarthyites? Which is a great. And of course, they show how they were talking about how they actually set up in certain medical schools. They set up a strike force, a group of physicians and PhDs, and they will review cases of what doctors are doing, and they will make recommendations to governments and other investigatory agencies to go after these people. One of them is a PhD. His name is William Jarvis. He actually set up this committee against quackery at Loma Linda University, which is a medical school out in California. He actually helped set that up. They were actually going after people who were wanting to treat cancer using nutrition, which is ironic considering where William Jarvis works. Again, there were other things that they did. They began to create all these different committees that were always concerned about public safety, but really it was about stopping their competitors from having access to patients. And again, you can just see in the article here, this is Stephen Barrett again. It's a wonderful article. And one of the things that stopped it was a lawsuit. It was a lawsuit which it was started by Chester Wilk. Chester Wilk was a chiropractor, and he filed a lawsuit based on the information they got from the informant Sore Throat. And they basically said that the AMA was acting as a corrupt organization. They basically went after him under RICO charges, which is the racketeering and corrupt organization using its influence. That's what they went after them on. And they were able to present this information to several judges. And the federal court judge ruled that, hey, the AMA was acting as a corrupt organization and was using anti-competitive practices to shut down anyone who wasn't going to practice medicine the way the AMA thought that they should. And so this document here, if you look, it says special communication. This was actually published in the Journal of American Medical Association in 1988. And this is the federal judge's decision. So this is actually a legal document which the Journal of American Medical Association had to publish. They had to publish what the findings of the court were, basically double humiliation. It's one thing that you lost in court, but now you have to publish your loss to all your members so that they know that the American Medical Association cannot stop you from working with other members of the medical community, including chiropractors, that you cannot shut them down. You cannot go to your state government and try to prevent them from getting on insurance plans. You can't do this. This is wrong. And it nearly bankrupted the American Medical Association, which is crazy to think that they were able to get away with all that. But that shows you just how bad it was in that system at that time. And so, long story short, the battle between chiropractic and allopathic medicine has gone on for some time. And it actually took a federal lawsuit to bring them up on charges for, corrupt influence and racketeering to actually stop them from suppressing natural medicine, including chiropractic. It's an amazing thing.
That is incredible history. And folks, this happened. I mean, this isn't like Dr. Tim, he's a chiropractor and this is just his view of things. This actually happened, what you just heard. And, I appreciated too, Dr. Tim, you spent more time warning about the potential pitfalls within the natural healing community than you did talking about the limitations of allopathic medicine. You're a scholar. You approach this objectively. I mean, we all have our perspective and our experience, but as objectively as you can. So I really appreciate the recounting of that history. And it tells us that it's kind of like other industries, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is not any different in the sense that it's about monopoly. It's about having a product, having a service, and you want to maximize profits. And I'm not saying that your family member who's a doctor is some kind of corrupt guy with the AMA or something. But when this goes back to Rockefeller money with the Flexner report, it just stinks. And so we've got to have a higher degree of skepticism and just critical thinking, and skepticism also of the conspiracy theory that somebody cooks up that may have no basis.
Right.
But you've just walked us through history, not a theory.
No, absolutely. I was going to say this, the AMA is not as powerful as it used to be. I mean, they still have power, but the shift has now just been to the drug companies. The drug companies now set up their own groups. Like, for example, I was looking up diseases today because I'm working on a project talking about the gut microbiome, and I'm going to be talking about the effect of the gut on autism. And there's a condition called hepatic encephalopathy, and that's basically where your liver starts failing and it starts messing with your brain, and it has to do with gut permeability. And I'll leave it there. Maybe that will be another topic of discussion. But the interesting thing was the first site that I pulled up to learn about hepatic encephalopathy was essentially funded by a drug company. And what you begin to realize is that drug companies actually try to steer people to this, and they create even focus groups. There's a whole drug company funded patient advocacy group to make sure that more kids get on Ritalin. And there's drug company funded advocacy groups to make sure that drugs are available to people. And then you would say, well, that's not bad. But what's happening is you're only pushing one therapy, and that therapy has a lot of money behind it. We just, many people were interested in the Robert F. Kennedy confirmation hearings. And some person remarked it would have been nice had the people asking the questions, if there had been like a little chyron at the bottom saying how much money you took from Pfizer, how much money did you take from these drug companies? And I think that's important, because just because the allopathic, the American Medical Association is no longer the big player that it used to be, the drug companies have all the funding to sort of steer medicine in this way. There was a report published in 2005 where Harvard medical students walked out of their class because their teachers had undisclosed financial interest with drug companies, and they did not tell them. So they're talking to them about, well, this is how you treat hyperlipidemia with all these different statins and things like that, not realizing that the person teaching you that actually has a financial vested interest in that drug company which produces that drug. And so we still have a lot of work to do. I think today there's a lot more understanding between the different healing disciplines. There's still some animosity here and there, but there's a little bit more understanding, a lot more cooperation. But now medicine is mostly directed by drug companies. And I think we have to work to really examine that and ask ourselves, is this the way we want to heal? I'm not saying all drugs are bad, but what I am saying is that if you drug first, you may be missing on an opportunity to do things more simply that actually don't harm the body at all.
God's methods. Oh, you can't disagree with that. And we're going to have some other conversations, I think. Gut, brain, more on the natural healing methods. And Dr. Tim, what you have shared with us, I think, gives us a historical and philosophical framework that is accurate, that is balanced, that helps us navigate these waters of this corporate system and with the competing claims that are made. And by the way, I do want to underscore one thing you said that's like the headline of the whole interview to me. Was it Gaucher in the British Medical in the British Medical Journal? 100,000 deaths per year from correctly prescribed medications, and over 10 years, 1 million people die. That's unbelievable.
2014 Polish Archives of Internal Medicine. I said it wrong. Polish Archives of Internal Medicine. And he estimated that 200,000 people die of drugs. And you're right, 100,000 just taking the drugs as prescribed. So think about it. You get a drug, you take it, and you're like, oh, everything's going to be all right. And you don't wake up. And again, the other issue is that we have polypharmacy. And his point was that another 100,000 die because there's always drug-to-drug interactions. And once you give someone five pharmaceuticals, all you have to do is look up each drug on a website, or you can get the physician's desk reference. And what you begin to realize is just how difficult it is to balance the drug-to-drug interactions. It's very tough. So that's what he was saying. And that's eye-opening.
And I want to underscore, folks listening, consult a qualified healthcare professional according to your worldview and philosophy. If you're, wanting to try natural methods of healing, if you're wanting to get off of medications. So just a disclaimer, this isn't medical advice of any kind, diagnosing, treating, curing, preventing, or anything of that nature. But that stat right there is a big takeaway for me. You hear the big news headlines about a Vioxx scandal, right?
Yes.
But this undercurrent of just this baseline 100,000 plus, depending on how you describe it, as you were saying, you could call it 200,000 with just as much credibility. And I mean, any amounts of thousands is a huge number of people.
Yes.
And we had 3,000 people killed on 9/11. That's a really big deal.
Yes.
And we're talking about really a medical system that probably has had really good PR and maybe an exaggerated reputation in many ways. Also has its strengths, as you mentioned, with the intensive care unit and so on.
I mean, look, there are people alive because of certain medical devices. There are people alive because they have a terrible condition and the drug keeps them alive. There's no question that in some instances the drugs are indicated, but the problem is that now we come to this point where we want to drug every single thing and not let the body fight, develop. It's a paradigm which says you need a drug for every situation. And I was reading an article in the Journal of American Medical Association. It was a 2022 article, and they were talking about how powerful natural immunity is. And they said that basically they want to develop a vaccine that mimics natural immunity. And part of me is like, well, if natural immunity is good, why don't we try to build and boost that?
Right.
Why add drugs to it? However you feel about vaccines, it doesn't matter. But the question is why don't we try to boost natural immunity? Why don't we work with what we're given first? If you need other things, that's fine. But why aren't we trying to do what is natural first? That's my sort of thrust on that.
Absolutely. And if you're in a car accident, that's a different story. And, I had surgery about 15 years ago. I had a hernia and had hernia surgery.
Yep.
But other than that, I've been able to, by God's grace, for 21 years, take no medications. I mean, not even a Tylenol.
Amen.
I use Revitagard, right? I use things like that. So, Dr. Tim, I think you've given us a balanced perspective on this. A lot of respect for not only your profession, but your scholarly approach here. And that's why I was really looking forward to this interview. And I think, Dr. Tim, you've brought us something that makes me hungry for more, for another interview another time. But do you have any closing thoughts as we say goodbye to our listeners today?
Yes, I say this. Whatever you do in medicine, always remember that you are the ultimate stakeholder. It's your body or your child's body. And because if you know that, then you do your research, you look into it, you try to understand how the body works. Because no one has to live with your medical decisions except for you. The doctor who tells you this or that, the chiropractor tells you this or that, you have to live with it. So do your homework, do your research, and most importantly, start off with the least invasive, and if you have to do the most invasive, that's okay. But try to start there, and that way you can literally say, I've tried everything else. So that's my take home for you.
That's a good approach. So thank you, Dr. Tim Perenich, for being with us. The website, again, is drtimperenich.com, and we'll see you on our next episode. And I'm your host, Scott Ritzema. Do follow CDN. Jeremy, great job in the production again. CDN YouTube channel as well, from likes to lives changed. And subscribe there with that QR code. And we'll see you all next time.